As usual, having my first 2 liters of water and my first as usual. Talking about generational wealth today as I struggle with this water cap. Generational wealth. Super simple concept. Very simple to do. Even goes as far as to be very easy to do. It's not easy to maintain though, right? Some simple things are still difficult, right? So it's really simple to pull an engine out of a car. You just unhook everything connected to the engine and then you pull it out of the car, right? But it's not an easy thing, even though it's a simple thing. So a lot of business structures, a lot of business fundamentals are exactly the same way. They're really simple. They're not overly complicated, which is why you have so many business owners that have little to no formal education, right? So they're super easy, but that doesn't, or they're super simple rather, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're easy, right? So they may have a level of difficulty in the application that makes them, difficult or hard, but they're not complex. They're simple. X, Y, Z, right? But X, Y, and Z might weigh 1,000 pounds. So lifting them might have a level of difficulty to them, right? So anytime we make things complicated, we're typically going down the wrong path. It should be fairly simple, but that doesn't mean that it's easy. Discipline is one of those things. Consistency is one of those things, right? Doing something over and over and over again the same way is as simple as it gets. There's nothing complicated about that. But life happens, things happen, so it becomes pretty difficult, right? Like I attempt to be here consistently around this time every day, right? That's a consistency that I attempt to build in to what I'm doing here. But 2 weeks ago, my father unexpectedly died. Right, you guys. If you guys were here, you guys were on the live when I got the phone call that my father died. Right, the next day I wasn't here. Right, the consistency broke down. Right, so that was life that just happened, and it made it difficult to maintain that consistency. It's always difficult to maintain consistency, right? And so that consistency broke down. So simple, really simple. Just keep doing the same thing over and over again, but not easy. So that's essentially the story for most business structures and things of that nature. So generational wealth, super simple, super duper simple. Have wealth compound, okay? Have wealth compound and make sure that it's set for the next generation. Teach the next generation to do the same. That's it. It's not ridiculously, complicated, but the discipline of compounding, and investing is even worse than saving typically. So what do? We typically set people up, not even typically, people who enter our generational wealth program are set up with offshore non-grantor generational wealth trusts, right? This makes it easier for them because they can't touch it, right? So it's the same thing our parents used to do where they'd go to the bank and get a 6 month CD, right? And they lock their money up in a 6 month CD and then they couldn't touch it, right? Or there were even, in my time, there were things like Christmas savings accounts, right? Parents would get this savings account and like take a certain percentage of their direct deposit and have it automatically go into this Christmas savings account. And then if they didn't touch that account until whatever November or whatever, the bank would actually double the interest rate. Right. That was a product I used to see yearly from a bank that had a deal with Walmart called Woodforce. Woodforce. They used to do a deal like that yearly, where it'd be like, okay, your regular interest is 2%, but if you maintain your holiday savings account until the holidays, then we're going to give you 4%, right? Okay, fine. So all these incentives to do this thing that is difficult to do. Simple, just save money, not complicated, simple, but not easy, right? So, what the methodology that we utilize, especially since for our generational wealth trusts, most of those people are not wealthy. Wealthy people typically have discipline. That's typically how they got there. So it's a little easier to deal with them, a little easier to work with them. But generational wealth trust fund folks are not wealthy. They're building wealth for the next generation, right? So they don't have the discipline that wealthy people have. So it's a little harder on them. By their own design, yes, but still harder. So the offshore trust allows them to make that one payment into a trust that's offshore, have corporate trustees manage the trust, so lawyers, essentially managing the trust. And then it sits there and it waits for the next generation. Doesn't matter what happens to them. Doesn't matter if they need a new kidney. Doesn't matter if they got into a car accident. Doesn't matter if they got a leg amputated. They can't touch the money. Doesn't matter what happens, right? Doesn't matter if their daughter needs to get married. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter, right? So that turns it into an easy situation, okay? And they typically part with an easy amount of money, for them. So whether it's one tax return, right? There's some people who they get set up on, a grand. They take $1,000 and they get set up on that $1,000, right? Or there's people who they understand what's going on. Still difficult for them to manage it themselves, but they understand the premise and the concept, and so they'll get the maximum amount of money they can get together, and they'll start with that, right? Which obviously cuts down the time for compounding significantly. So completely different strokes for different folks, but the inability to access the funds in the plan once the plan begins is typically the number one thing that folks are interested in, and that it's protected from them, right? There's quite a few people who just enjoy the added protection, but there are actually some folks who are like, look, stuff happens in my life because of my job, or because of my business. I get sued 2-3 times a year, whatever the case may be. And so I need this protected from me. I need my kids' generational wealth protected from, the work that I do even. And so those folks really appreciate the offshore non-grantor trust because it's immune to any local court orders outside of this jurisdiction. We do all of those trusts in Kenya, right? So doesn't matter what happens to you in the U.S., in Canada, even in the U.K., it doesn't matter. The kid's legacy is going to be secured in the trust. And it has to be legitimate. It has to be the kid's legacy, right? Some of our investor clients also use a trust, but it's not a generational wealth trust, right? So they are the beneficiary of the trust themselves. They're still not the trustee, but they are the beneficiary, right? So, in that case, it's a different scenario. But for these generational wealth builders out here, you want to move step by step, right? So what's the first step? First step is to figure out exactly what the family is about, right? That's the most important first step that everybody skips. People skip it because a lot of the folks that are out here selling trusts, right? They wouldn't be able to make any money off of that step. So that's why they never talk about it. But the first step is the family constitution, right? You need to get a good, solid family constitution going. That family constitution has to cover certain aspects of what you want your future to look like, right? So the family constitution has to cover the number one most important thing is conflict resolution. We've learned over the years, in actual practice, that the conflict resolution article of the Constitution is the most important, most impactful thing to your family, period. Right? Nothing else even comes close. So that's number one, bar none, is the conflict resolution. All right. The conflict resolution will keep the family together in the worst of situations. So not only is it something, to be developed, but it's something that every member of the family post development needs to know. It's one of the parts of the family constitution that you want to make sure that everyone in the family understands, and has almost memorized, right? They know exactly what'll happen, when, why, how, and move forward from there. Because you want to make sure that the family constitution, that one of its, well, not the family constitution, but the conflict resolution article of the family constitution, one of its functions is going to be to eliminate bias during serious situations in the family, right? So the function of that conflict resolution article is going to be to eliminate bias when there are, major issues in the family, right? That allows family members to accept whatever judgments and consequences come, out of the process, right? So the pro to that, the benefit of that, is that families don't fall apart that could have otherwise stuck together. Okay, super duper important. All right, in the United States, where I'm from, individualism is pushed and praised to the masses, but all of the richest groups out there are all families, right? That those individuals, who buy into that, can never beat families, and they all run to families for funding. Right? All that funding, when you look at all the funding and you go to the top of the funding, it all comes from family offices. If you've never heard of that, you need to Google it. It all comes from family offices. So all of those, rich, successful individuals run to families to get their money. All right? No individual can beat a family. So the family constitution needs to set the groundwork for how that family works, what that family is into, what are the morals, the goals, so on and so forth. It needs to be the foundational framework for the family, not a prison. Okay, so you don't want to, turn around and say, oh, okay, well, everyone in my family has to be a doctor. I'm a dermatologist, so you guys all have to be dermatologists, and we're building a dermatology dynasty. No, now you're losing family members almost immediately, right? 'Cause somebody's grandkids don't care about dermatology. That's not the way you do it, right? That's the worst attempt at doing it, ever, right? It falls apart within a generation. Always, every time we see somebody, force that, falls apart in a generation, right? So it has to be, a solid framework of things, that your family is about, right? So what does that look like? Your family can be about philanthropy, right? Then people can choose how they want to be philanthropic. Your family can be about the arts and the sciences, right? Then people can choose which art they like and which science they like, right? So we have, there's a family I'm thinking of, clients of ours, that they have a similar setup, right? Not necessarily that there's philanthropy in their, or philanthropy in their family constitution, but they have that whole arts and sciences thing, right? Very big into the arts and sciences. Now, the the father and the mother who set up the basically the patriarch and the matriarch of the family, who set up the family constitution. The mother was a I don't even know what they call him, someone who does like pottery out of clay, right? I guess a sculptor, but she doesn't do sculptures. She does like pottery, right? Okay. And then the father does like Rembrandt, and level like paintings and stuff like that. Big art people, right? National Endowments of the Arts, all of that, right? And so they were big on the arts and all of that. The son, the first generation after the family constitution, picked up and followed in with the arts, but he does martial arts, way removed from the mother and the father, who do like classical, pottery and Rembrandt style, painting, right? But he's still in the arts. He's still following the kind of guidance of the family constitution, right? So it needs to be like that. It needs to be that there's a framework But inside that framework, people can really stretch out and do what they want to do, right? Not necessarily what the founder or the patriarch or the matriarch of the family has set up for everyone to do. So you don't want it to be restrictive. You just want it to be a guidance. Okay. Why? What's the big deal with the guidance thing? Well, over the years we've noticed that families pause, individual members of families pause, and they have this kind of introspective moment. And that introspective moment in life is when they start asking questions like, why am I here? What's the point of life? You know, what am I here to do? Do I have a destiny? Things of that nature, right? And so that's a phase that quite a few people, I would even go so far as to say the majority of people go through. Folks that come from dynasty families don't ask those questions because the family constitution tells them what it is that they're there to do, what the focus is, why they're there, the history of the family, what have those who came before them done, what was the outcome of what they did, so on and so forth, right? So if it's too restrictive, though, they lose their identity in that, right? So with the dermatologist example, they lose their identity, like, oh, I was just born to be a dermatologist. But if it's, hey, we focus on the science and the arts, and you're like, you know what? Okay, medical sciences, and in fact, inside those medical sciences, I really want to, do something with the skin. Now we're good. You know what I mean? Now the freedom is there, the guidance is there to make sure that they're heading in the right direction, but the freedom is there to make sure that they can show who they are, right? They can make sure that it's all them, that it all comes from them, that it's their choice, and that they do something that they're actually passionate about. And what eventually happens with the generational wealth is everyone identifies and follows a passion. No one is doing a job because they don't have to, right? There's too much money in the family for them to be sitting there doing some job they can't stand. They're all following a passion. Now, the education takes them through experiences that they may not like, right? But that's a education pathway that's already preset, right? So they might have to go through and take some internships and do some things that they don't like doing. That builds character, and that's part of the discipline, and that's part of the education that you leave to the next generation and all of that. But when they come into their own and they are now in charge of their life, right? They've gone through all the education, they've gone through all the rearing, they've gone through all the upbringing, and now it's them against the world, right? At that point, they will always kind of engage in passion projects. And it might change. They might think they're passionate about something, get into it, and realize, like, oh, wow, this is not what I thought it was. That happens all the time, right? We see the glamorous side of an industry, and we think, oh, cool, I'm going to go, you know, be part of that, glamorous side of the industry forever, and then realize that that's 1% of the industry, right? So that does happen. But overall, those folks are going to be working on their passions moving forward. And if their passions connect with the stated goals of the family, then the family tend to move forward from there every generation. And then it gets like roots, where it moves forward in multiple directions, generation after generation. That typically happens right around the third generation, right? Right around the third generation, there's typically some branch families that enter the family tree that are focused on different things, and typically in different geographic locations, right? And that's also typically the beginning of the family office if everything is being done the right way. So back to the beginning, to generation zero, right? That conflict resolution is number one in the family constitution. Okay, great. We got conflict resolution, and we know how to keep the family held together. Next thing is going to be, what is that family about? Right? So it's going to be the morals, the values, the principles of the family, right? And a lot of that's going to be based in what the family has accomplished in the past. Okay, so if no history, then it can be based in what you want to accomplish as a family. If there's some history, then a lot of that's going to be based in whatever the family has accomplished in the past. Because whatever you can root in factual social proof is going to be easier for your descendants to push forward. If it's just a philosophical concept has never actually been achieved by your family, then it's much more difficult for the descendants to push that agenda forward when no one in the family has ever done it. All right. So you want to lean into the things that you've accomplished and go from there. That's why, like families with an alma mater, it's way easier for those descendants to go get that degree at that alma mater because someone has done it before them, right? They're a legacy, right? So, and they call it that because that's how legacy building works. So the easiest way to do that is to lean into something that has been done in the past, right? So whether it's, we own businesses and, the person who started this whole thing owned the business and it started like that, or we're educators, the person who started this was a teacher. It could be, we're healers, the person who started this was a nurse, whatever the case may be, right? But you want to make sure that all of that guidance is uh, is centered around historical proof, if at all possible. You can start without it. It does make your job harder, but if you have historical proof, start there. Okay. All right. Great. So that's kind of the second phase that you want to make sure is in there. The next phase is you want to figure out what family actually means, right? Is it just blood? Is there something more to it? So you want to figure out what that is and agree upon it with whoever is part of the process. If no one is part of the process, and we do get quite a few people who are just building their own lines of family, right? Some are orphans, that happens sometimes. Others are just done with their family because their family didn't have a constitution or conflict resolution. So conflict broke out, and now half the family doesn't talk to the other half of the family, and they don't really want that to happen again. So now they're actually building, a real defined family and moving forward from there. And so you got to figure that out because that's also going to be the declaration for membership, right? So whatever that means to you, whatever you figure out on that, that's going to be what determines who's a member of your family versus who is not a member of your family. There also has to be a mechanism to expel members of the family, right? It can't be, I'll give you a kind of working example. Most of you guys who've been following me for a long time know that my first business was a martial arts school, all right? And so in other martial arts schools, you walk through the door, you pay somebody some money, you get a uniform, and it comes with a white belt, right? And you tie the white belt on, and you're part of the school, okay? You're a white belt. If that's what it takes to become a white belt, right? Have a great night, Eris. Great to see you. If that's what it takes to become a white belt, what's the difference between the person who's in the martial arts school and the person who's sitting at the bus stop? Aren't they both white belts? Because they did nothing but pay a little money, and all of a sudden they're wearing a white belt, right? So in my martial arts school, when you came in, you didn't have a belt. You had to earn the white belt. You had to do things that you hadn't done before, so that you set yourself up walking down the street on the sidewalk and earn, the equivalent of the white belt, right? We did kung fu, so it was a white sash. But you came in and you were pre-sash. You were pre-sash for about 4 classes, and you had to learn all your fundamentals and your basics. You had to understand the history of our martial arts and who was the master, and all of that stuff before you could put on the white belt, right? So there needs to be something in place like that for the family as well. Is it just, any old body that shares blood with you is magically part of the family? It can be. You can do that, or it can be deeper than that, right? Um, there are people that we're related to that are not family, right? So you have to figure out how that works for you. There's no right or wrong. You just got to figure it out and stick to it. All right. But that's going to determine both who's a member of the family and that's going to lead into how people are expelled from the family. Sometimes people do like really, really heinous things. It is what it is. And when those heinous things happen, sometimes the appropriate response is to then kick that person out of the family if the family is working towards something, right? Now that one, you want that to be an extreme position. You don't want to be kicking people out of the family left and right, but it should be a measured response. So if there's an extreme issue, then that might be the proper response, right? We've, as far as I've never had out of my family, so there's that. And as far as the clients who have kicked people out of their families and stuff like that, it's no very, very, very significant. Um, Things like grape, right? Like there was, definitely a client who's, I don't think it was the son. I want to say it was like the nephew or something like that. But they ended up, being convicted, and then upon the conviction was also expulsion from the family. Um, but like things like addiction typically don't merit like expulsion from the family, right? So it's not like someone who annoys you, right? You kick them out the family. It's not like that. Shouldn't be like that anyway. So you want to have mechanisms to build people up who are just like on hard times, essentially. And so most of the families have an article about addiction actually, and like how do we process that, and how do we get them in the rehab, and how do we support their journey to coming back from addiction and all of that stuff. So like those types of things require family support, but things where family support doesn't solve anything and where it's heinous and where it's harmed people outside and within the family, those are the situations typically where expulsion is appropriate. So, if somebody takes a life, in cold blood or something like that, there's nothing you can do about it. You know, those are the things where the family is going to have to come together and figure out what do we do about this. If people are sick, typically, even if it's criminally like insane, then typically the family is going to find them some kind of medical solution. But outside of that, that the options should be on the table, right? Because if you can't lose it, it's not real, right? That's a lot of if you go back and you look at like the psychology of success, you look at the science behind it and the studies they've done on it, which there are numerous. And if you're going to look it up, don't Google it. Go to scholar.google.com, right? Um, Google Google lies on purpose, right? Google has admitted this. We talked about this the other day, right? So Google has admitted that because its business is advertising and it's free for you, right? You don't pay when you do a Google search. They get paid based on advertising. So in order to make sure that they keep getting paid, they actually reduce the accuracy of the Google search to make sure that you have to search twice to get what you're actually looking for. And that allows them to show you more ads. They've admitted this, right? Because it's free. You use it for free. So they've admitted, like, look, you want to start paying for it, or this is how we pay for it, right? So they've admitted this. So you don't want to use like a regular Google search for stuff like this. What you typically want to use is the nonprofit side of Google, which is scholar.google.com. That will give you a scholarly search where you will only get facts, not people's feelings. So you can look this stuff up and do your own research on it and see how it actually works. But the psychology is if you can't lose it, it's not valuable. It's worthless, essentially, right? And there needs to be a certain level of tension to forge success, right? So successful people have a certain level of tension and a certain level of even stress, if you want to call it that, as they're developing, that's uniform with all successful people, no matter how you measure that success, right? And so you want to make sure that it's not just a gimme. Like you were just born into this thing. You'll always be. There's no way that to be removed. No matter what you do, it's acceptable. No, it's not acceptable. You are a steward of a legacy, and if you don't steward that legacy properly, then you will be removed from the legacy, right? So that tension has to be there. All right. Any questions on that? Understand the framework of how that family and how a generational wealth family works and why it works. You guys got that so far? Yeah, no, no, it's not for everybody. You're absolutely correct. It's absolutely not for everybody. Absolutely 100% not for everybody. This, these structures are legitimately only for people who are serious about building families that maintain dynasties over the years, right? Building families that take on responsibility, that stop making excuses, that get things done and affect global change. Those are the people that end up buying into this. This is absolutely 100% not for everyone. Some people just don't even care enough, right? You have to care about your family for real to even start this journey. Most people really don't. They say they do, but they really don't. Their actions say differently, right? The things that they do, the positions they put their family in, where they set them up for failure, like their actions are so opposite to the things they say, that it's just not true, and they just live in that bubble or that lie, claiming that they care and they love their people when all their actions are 100% opposite of that, right? Like I came up in the hood. Those of you guys who've been following me for a while know that I was born in project housing, and at the age of 4, we got out of project housing and moved to the hood, right, which was actually worse than the projects. And so that's where I came from. I've seen people who put their lights on in their children's name with their children's social security number and they don't pay the bills. And then when their kids grow up and are trying to buy their first house and get married, they have 18 years of bad credit, because there is such a thing as a juvenile credit bureau in the United States of America, disgusting as it is. And they can't get anything. They can't get their first car. They can't get nothing because their mama got 12 electric bills in their name in 12 different apartments over the last 18 years that they've never paid, but they say they love their family, right? So there are people who will just say that because it's the right response, it's the politically correct response, but their actions show that the only thing they love is themselves, right? So you're definitely right. It's not for everybody. Not everybody, has the love of family to even start down this path. Not everybody understands what family means. Not everybody cares. So it's definitely very specific to certain people who really care about their family for real, who really want the best for their family and are okay with that not benefiting them. People who start real generational wealth, they do not benefit from that generational wealth. It's generational wealth, right? Not my generation's wealth, generational wealth, right? So it doesn't start as wealth with them. It only becomes wealth about a generation later, right? Unless you're already wealthy, then it's not generational wealth. Then we call that inheritance. That's a different thing, right? So if you're already wealthy, then you're passing on inheritance. If you're not already wealthy, then you're building the structure for generational wealth, and that does not benefit you, right? Hey, Eddie, what's going on? So you really have to have a love for your future, for your family. A lot of times, like, so for example, with myself, and a lot of times when you build out a company, your target clients are a lot like you. And hey, Tamiko, thank you for that. And so with myself, I was like an 18-year-old kid thinking about what my children would be like and thinking about what I had to do to make sure that my future wife and my future children were okay. Even before that, probably around 16, I was already thinking that way. Right? That was not standard. The people around me, no one thought that way. Absolutely no one. Right? So in my little microcosm of the universe, absolutely no one was thinking about what they had to do to make sure that their kids were okay at the age of 16. Right? I was the only one. Now, eventually, I found more people like that, in college and stuff like that. But even then, we were older. Who knows what they were doing at 16? But by 16, I already had this feeling of stewardship that the, you know, and some of that came from, like my family had immigrated, and my there was an old kind of, I don't know, parable or saying or whatever in my family from the old country, where elders would say, the only reason that we existed was so that you can exist now, right? And it was a way of saying, like, look, don't dishonor the sacrifices and the stewardship that we've made to make your life possible, right? Almost a way of saying, like, you are your ancestors' wildest dreams, like that type of thing, right? But there was this thing of the absolute only reason that we have existed is so that you can exist, right? And the only reason that you exist is so that your descendants can exist, right? So again, it kind of goes back, even though we didn't have a formal family constitution, that kind of goes back to the family constitution, eliminating that period of existential crisis in your life when you're thinking to yourself, why am I here? Why do I exist? Why was I born? What am I doing? All of that goes out the window when there's something locked in your family that says, okay, the only reason you exist is because of this. Now, what are you going to do about it, right? And so that changed, my focus. And so that even changed the way that I dealt with my environment. Most of the guys from my high school class had women pregnant, in high school, if not very shortly thereafter, right? And then now we got a bunch of single parents running around and stuff like that. I didn't engage in any of that nonsense, right? Because it was sacred. It was, a stewardship that I had in my mind, that I had to get set up. So my firstborn I had when I was 42, right? I didn't have a bunch of baby mamas running around and a bunch of, illegitimate children running around or any of that, because I had a purpose to what I was doing and what I was building, and there was some sacredness to that, right? And I wanted to make sure that the things that I could control, I controlled well, right? So very different mindset to some of the folks that were coming up with me, but a lot of that had to do with family structure. Okay, so putting that family constitution in place really, really affects the youth. All right, and gives them that structure where they're like, all right, this is how you do it. This is why we're doing it. This is what we're about. This is the crew we represent. Again, I came up, on some rough streets, so I understand the psychology of unity, right? We talk about independence, and especially Americans, and we talk about, getting it out the mud and doing it ourselves and all of that stuff, but we know that that's not true. We know that's not true just from our street existence, right? Just from the way that the gangs operate in the streets, just from the way that the crews operate in the streets, and how you join those organizations, and what about them makes the glue that holds them together so strong that they'll leave their mother and their grandmother at home and go to prison to protect the gang, right? It's the same psychology. You just need to employ that psychology for the family. But it's literally the same psychology. The mafia and the Kennedy family operate the same way as far as, loyalty goes, and as far as keeping things in the family goes. right? The mafia and the Rockefeller family operate the exact same way, right? Any family that is set up as a dynastic family operates the exact same way. The only difference is what the intention is, right? And like the businesses that they engage in. Even the Black Panthers originally, right? They operate. Even the Crips originally, right? The original Crips were like Black Panthers, right? They operated in such a way to uplift the community, and then it lent itself. Anything that's underground would eventually lend itself to criminality. Same thing with the triads. If you go back and you look at the history of the Chinese triads, same thing. Community organization that was ended up going underground, and when it went underground, it lent itself to criminality, and that's when it became the mafia organization that it is, today. So same type of thing. It's the focus that changes whether or not there's some kind of criminal, organization and enterprise going on, or there's a legitimate business enterprise and organization going on, which is what you want. You want to build that legitimate family that operates with discipline, and operates with stewardship, but is a completely and 100% above board. That's what you're looking for, right? And that only works when there's no bias in the family. Even in the criminal organization, if there's a favorite who can do anything and get away with anything, that organization will fall apart. Even the favorite person, when they screw up, they gotta face the same consequences as the black sheep. That's what the family constitution helps assist with. Helps to make sure that when something goes wrong, which is when people care, when everything's going right, nobody really cares, right? But when something goes wrong, the family is going to pay attention as to whether or not that situation was handled with fairness and unbiased, or whether there's some biased favorite group within the family that can get away with anything. You do not want that. You want to make sure that everything is fair and unbiased within the family. Hey, Jerry, what's going on, man? So that's huge. So that's a huge sticking point in the family constitution. All right. The family constitution can inform the family trust deed. So once the family constitution is done, it is a very simple thing to now move on to a family trust. Okay. Within the family constitution, remember we were talking about you also need a mechanism to, number one, kick people out of the family, and then the mechanism by which you define who is in the family, right? And it should probably be more than just blood. That might be the foundation, right? But there should probably be more to it than that. And so once you have that worked out, then you can start looking at your family trust, and your family constitution will inform what's called the trust deed. The trust deed will rule the trust. No matter who you let control the trust, right, which is typically a trust company. So it's a corporation. Typically, it has some lawyers in it, right? And it's a corporation that their entire existence is to run trusts. And every trust they run, they take that trust deed and they put that in a file. And every time somebody asks anything of the trust, or it's time to do anything with the trust, they pull out the trust deed and they look over the trust deed. What is this trust allowed to do? And they execute based on that trust deed, right? What will inform that trust deed is the family constitution. Now, they might not have the family constitution, but the family is the one who creates the trust deed. The trustee is bound by the trust deed, right? I know a lot of people are like, well, when you make the trust owns it, and you give away the thing, you don't own it anymore. How can you do that? It's because of the trust deed. It's because you're the one who wrote the trust deed. So while, yes, you don't legally own the thing anymore, the trust owns it. The trust can only do what you've told the trust to do. Now, the issue becomes you need some guidance with that, because there's definitely situations where you don't know what's going to come up because you don't have enough experience. And so you don't know what might pop up that need to be handled. And if you don't give the trust the ability to handle them, then you're going to be screwed. Really, really, really good example of that is we had a family from Virginia. They came to us. They already had a domestic trust. They needed an offshore trust. And they came to us to do all of that work for them. And the domestic trust owned LLCs and each LLC owned a rental property that was essentially their children's college fund, right? So they had these rental properties. They didn't really profit from the rental properties. All of the money went into these funds for their kids' college, right? So it was essentially a generational wealth setup. And so now they were expanding, and they were going to have our offshore trust be the umbrella that was a trustee for their domestic trust, and owned the entire thing, right? Was at the top of the pyramid, essentially. And so what ended up happening was, during this process, one of their tenants stopped paying their rent. And so, they sent out the notices. The trustee that was in the US sent out the notices and all of that stuff, and the tenant still didn't pay their rent. And after the notices were done, the trustee just stopped. And so they were like, what's going on with this trustee? We're going to sue this trustee. He's not, what you can do if the trustee not doing what's in the trust deed, you can have the courts sanction, punish, and replace them. And so, like, what's going on? We're going to have to do this thing with this trustee. So the trustee came back and was like, well, you can do that if you want, but you're going to lose, because you're the one who wrote the trust deed. And in the trust deed, it says that we can collect the rents. It says we're supposed to put the money for the rent in this account, and that account is supposed to be for your kids' future and all of that great stuff. But you did not give me the authority to evict anyone, which was true. So the trustee legally couldn't evict anyone from these apartments because they never put that in the trust deed, and it was an irrevocable trust. So to change the trust deed was extraordinarily difficult. So it took them years, and eventually the tenant caught on and told all the other tenants. So now all the other tenants stopped paying their rent because we can't get kicked out. I don't know why, but they did something. We can't get kicked out. You don't have to pay. So now you got 2 years. Your kids' college plan, which was a good plan, in the beginning it was working, has now fallen apart, because instead of paying a lawyer a couple $1,000s to write a proper trust deed, they wanted to save that couple $1,000s, so they ended up losing actually millions, because what ended up happening is they had to go to a judge to disregard the trust. By the time the judge disregarded the trust, everything shot back into their name. Well, the IRS saw that as, oh, cool, you just gained $2 million in assets. 6, 7 apartments just flew right back into your name. Looks to us like you just bought these. Your net worth just went up personally, because it used to be trust that owns it. Now you own it again. Sounds like a taxable event to me. So now you got to go fight the IRS, in tax court, and have that handled, right? And then you still have to evict the people. You still got to go to court for the expense of the eviction and all of that added headache and expense, because I tried to save some pennies in the beginning, right? So when you're dealing with trusts like that, you need a professional to write it. Someone who has the experience, who can be like, wait a minute, you're running short-term rentals through this? How do you evict people? You didn't put any clause in here about evicting people. What happens if they don't pay, right? A professional would have caught that and said, okay, well, then you need to give the trustee the ability to go to court on your behalf and evict people, right? So irrevocable trusts, you don't do yourself. You make sure you have professionals that help you out with that. Estate attorneys, there are such things as trust professionals, like certified trust professionals who are not attorneys. So you can do that as well. A lot of that is country specific, right? So there's that, but even a really solid tax professional can really assist you with trust, because some of what you're looking at with the trust is tax stuff, right? So even like a really solid tax professional can assist you with those things as well, especially the grantor non-grantor status. If you're an American, that means something to you, right? So if you're American, grantor non-grantor is treated completely different in the IRC, the Internal Revenue Code, right? So you want to go to the IRS website, right? So go to irs.gov. There's a little search box up in the corner, and put in grantor trust or non-grantor trust, and see what the IRS says those things are, and see what the differences are, right? You'll see that if it's a non-grantor trust, you don't need to tell the IRS anything until there's a distribution to a U.S. citizen, right? If it's a grantor trust, you need to make all kinds of tax filings, every year to the IRS and disclose bank account information and all kinds of other stuff every year. So for certain people, that's okay, depending on what their setup is. For other people, that is a pain in the ass, and and is overkill. So you want to know what the differences between those two things are, and then make a decision accordingly, right? Most of our clients have non-grantor trusts when it comes to generational wealth trusts. We do some asset protection trusts. That's different, right? Some of those clients, they can't be non-grantor, and they do the filings because they're protecting assets, and they're U.S. assets. And so it's very difficult then to get a non-grantor status in that case. But the protection of those assets, because of what they're worth, it's worth it to do those filings. So you just got to get with your professional and figure out, which column you fit into. Right? So that's the evolution of the generational wealth, from setting up what your family looks like, what your family's about, what your morals are, what you're focused on. That then gets you into a place where you can start compounding money towards that, which is what the trust is for, the generational wealth trust anyway. So you start compounding money toward those goals. And then over time, that money compounds into wealth. And then once you have wealth, you start deploying wealth for whatever the focus of your family is, hopefully for the good of mankind. and wealth begets wealth, right? Once you get to that point, you're solid, right? You're all the way solid. So those are the steps. That's how you get there, okay? Any questions on generational wealth planning, generational wealth systems? Any questions on that? No, you don't have to use compounding for generational wealth. You can actually have two plans at the same time, right? And using compounding for both of them. For example, we have a relocation side of the business where we relocate people specifically to Kenya. One of the options in relocation is essentially to have passive income for the next 10 years, right? So you relocate, you don't have to work, you don't have to nothing, and it's based on compounding, except you spend the compound, so you're not really, compounding, right? But it's the same process. So what those folks do is when they come in, we end up bond laddering them, and they're guaranteed a specific amount of money out of that bond ladder per month, and that's going to be for like the next 20 years, right? So they're going to get a specific amount of money every month that should cover, their basic needs. They can change the amount, so the amount is based on them. The more they need, the more money they have to put in up front. The money is still theirs. At the end of the maturity of the bonds, that money gets kicked back out to them. Some of it's amortized, so you get the money little by little over time, kicked back out to you, but you get your entire principal back, right? So that's the same process, except they're not compounding it, they're living off of it, right? So folks could do the same thing, but they'll do it in a trust, right? And then that money will compound into big money very quickly because it's getting payments over and over and over again into the trust account. And then 30 years down the line, it's multi-millionaire time, right? So it's just a different way of implementing the same type of strategy. So in this context, we're talking about people who are doing the generational wealth stuff, and they're building money for the next generation, which is incredibly easy, right? What we're about to move into, which is why I ask questions now, what we're about to move into next is how you actually maintain the family, right? Because getting the money is actually the absolute easiest part. The difficult part is stewardship. So we're going to get into that next if no one has any other questions. But that was a good question. Any other questions on those basic structures of generational wealth and building a dynastic family. Hi, Coquetzo, Coquetzo. Let's see. All right, so we're good on that. We understand the structures, the foundations. We're good on that. Questions on that? We can move on to stewardship. If you're writing something now, just go ahead and press send and then finish it up so I know you're writing. If you're about to send something, just put a one in the chat. I'll wait for you. All right, looks like we're good. We understand the concept. We understand the basic foundations. We know what the family constitution is. We know how it should work. We know that the conflict resolution article of the Constitution is the most important article of the Constitution. Um, and we're solid on that. We know that the family constitution informs the trust deed. Now, in some jurisdictions, like this one actually, a family constitution can be used in place of a trust deed, right? But that's a technical difference that we can get into it on a different live right at the end of this one. All right, so moving forward, I've already illustrated that the money is easy. Money is not a hard thing to do if you're building wealth. Money is always easy when it doesn't benefit you, right? When the money doesn't benefit you, it's always easier. Okay. So we figured out how the money works. We know that the money is easy. We know that we can put $1,000 there, wait 60 years, and it's going to be almost $1,000,000. That's the easy part. All right, fine. What's the hard part? The hard part becomes the legacy, because the legacy is not up to you. You're already gone when the legacy starts, right? And that's what makes it the hard part. So the legacy part is based in education, right? It's something like 75% of all dynasty families fail in the first generation, right? So there's a generation zero, the generation that starts it. Then there's a first generation of the family, right? And then that generation, if they do not have the education, they just spend everything and it's done, right? Generation after is typically 50-50. So still big risk, right? And the same thing, the 50% that don't have the proper education, done, right? After that, you're typically golden, right? There's still a chance that the family might fall into disrepair or whatever, but after that, you're typically golden. The family is established and it ain't going nowhere, right? May change names a couple times depending on how many girls you have, right? They get married, the name changes, stuff like that. Um, like I believe, what is the name of the family? Is it Stryfer? The Kennedys have a bunch of branches, but the most prominent one is the one that Arnold Schwarzenegger married into. So when he was the governor of California, his wife was a Kennedy, either a Kennedy or a Rockefeller. Now I'm trying to think back to what it is, but she's a branch family. She has a completely different last name, right? But it's the most powerful branch in the family now, right? So that will happen. As you have daughters, obviously the names will change and all of that, right? No, she's definitely a Kennedy. Yes, okay, yeah, she's a Kennedy. All right, so but her name is not Kennedy. I can't remember the name to save my life. It's like Strider or something like that. But they're Kennedys. If you follow the family tree, they're absolutely Kennedys. So that will happen, right? You'll have your main branch of the family, and then especially with daughters getting married and stuff, names will change a little bit, but they'll still be part of the family. What typically happens with those is you'll have these branch lineages. Those branch lineages will typically start their own trust. And so their trust will be a beneficiary of the main trust, but none of the members of their house will be, right? So there'll be the main house that comes directly from the main person who started the family, and they will typically maintain the last name. They typically maintain the last name to the point where like the women in the family will like not take their husband's name. Sometimes the husbands take their name. And so that main branch will maintain their last name essentially, and then all these the trunk of the tree will maintain the last name, and then all the branches of the tree might have different names, and then they all have different trusts, and all those trusts are beneficiaries of the main trust, but the members of their family are not, right? So sometimes that happens. um yes, Shriver sounds right to me. Yes. um and they're a really good family. They're like they're like the strongest branch of the Kennedy family right now. Then you have people like RFK Jr., that make the main branch seem weaker than it actually is. So that's that's a talk for another day. But that's how it works. You can't really stop that. That's just what happens with descendants, and it comes quickly. It depends on how many children the children are having, but it comes quickly. There have been situations where there's a grandmother or a great grandmother who's living, who's responsible for 36 people, right? Like, she's the mother of 7 kids, and those 7 kids maybe all had 2 kids each, and but some of those 2 kids now have kids, and so she's living, she's alive, and there's 37 people that are directly descendant from her, right? And so it happens quickly. And so when that happens, there's normally a mechanism already in the family constitution to handle that, and to and also in the trust deed. The trust deed in that regard is actually more important than the family constitution, because that's where the money is. There's no money in the family constitution, just like there's no money in the American Constitution, right? The money is in the Treasury Department, and and all of that. So the trust is funded, right? The money in the trust is the trust fund, right? So the trust is funded, which activates the trust, and there's money in there. So in the trust, it's actually more important for inside the trust it to say, okay, when someone becomes a first cousin, their family now needs to establish a trust. That trust can be a beneficiary of this trust, but none of their family members moving forward will be direct beneficiaries of this trust. All right, so there needs to be, some kind of language in there that creates that system where the families still have to accomplish something, right? There were families that didn't have those kind of systems built in, and that was part of the downfall of the family, right? Super large, Carnegies and DuPonts, super large families, but there was no mechanism by which to make sure the branch families worked as hard as the trunk family, in the future, and like created their own destiny, but still owed that back to the original family, right? Why? Because if their trust is a beneficiary of the main trust, that typically means that trust is taking like business loans and all of that from the main family, which means it owes interest back to the main family, and probably owes equity back to the main family, right? So 10% of all the businesses that the branch families create are owned by the main family trust and all of that stuff, right? So the cohesion stays there, and there's a direct paper trail as to why you owe the original family trust, and why it makes sense. But it also allows them to go off and modify their own family constitution, and have different goals, and different values, but still be part of the greater family. And then you end up with almost jurisdictions, right? So like we have a couple families that have gotten pretty big at this point, and so like they have their banking jurisdiction in Singapore, and actually all of them do. All of our clients that are at that level, they all have a branch in Singapore, and that's where their family office is, right? And so that's where the banking branch of their family is established, essentially, whether it's investment banking or trust. That's where it's established. And then they might have an arts branch of the family, and that arts branch of the family is going to be headquartered out of whatever makes sense for them. There's one that's headquartered out of Ireland. There's another one that's actually headquartered out of New York. And so it just depends on like whatever that family is into. And then, then you're going to have the things that the members of the family are doing all over the place. And that's going to create essentially other headquarters of other minor branches of the family all over the place. So that's what it grows into. That's the down the road, large scale vision of what's going on with that family after you start developing, generational wealth. And so, like, Penske is one of those. There's a Penske Logistics. There's a Penske race team, which is still connected to the main branch, which is Roger Penske's branch of Penske. But there's like Penske, is it Ford? There's like a Penske Ford Lincoln Mercury or something like that, and which is not Roger Penske. That's a cousin, right? But it all leads back into the Penske family, right? And so there's a couple of those where you can look up. There's like a Penske real estate, empire thing. That's another cousin. That's not Roger Penske, right? But Roger Penske holds the main line of the Penske family, and then all these branches are tapping into that, but they have their own destiny and they have to run their own businesses. Roger's obviously the most successful, because he has the main line, but the other ones are successful in their own right. Like the Penske car dealership one, I think he has, I want to say he has 4 or 5 car dealership in Pennsylvania somewhere. And Roger Penske's headquarters for Penske Logistics is also in Flying Hills, Pennsylvania, or Green Hills, Pennsylvania, or something like that. So the family must have some roots in Pennsylvania, because most of the branch families are also, headquartered out of Pennsylvania. So these are how things work, and that's within one generation. There's already 2 other branches, right? So it works that way, and it can happen quickly, which is why you want to make sure that your foundation is so solid, because it'll get out of hand real quick if it's not, right? So education needs to be solid in order for stewardship to happen. Stewardship is big. Most people don't actually know what that is. So stewardship is going to be big, and teaching that is going to be paramount. If you do not teach the next generation stewardship, that family will absolutely fall apart. 100%. Right? 100% chance that it's going to fall apart. Right? So make sure that the education is there. Do we got that so far? We understand all of that? You let me know before I move on. All right, looks like we're good on that. All right, implementation. So now we got everything set up. The family is set up. Stewardship has been taught. So we have our family constitution set up. The trust is set up and funded, right? So now we have our family trust fund. Okay, now how are we implementing? How are we moving forward from there? The trust isn't doing much of anything. The trust is holding paper. Maybe the trust is giving out loans and grants and that type of stuff, maybe, depending on how the trust is set up. And that's it. Now, some of the paper that the trust owns might be stock certificates, share certificates, membership certificates, depending on what structure it is that we're talking about, right? An LLC has member shares, or member certificates, not shares of stock, right? They operate virtually exactly the same way. It just depends on what type of structure you're talking about. It has different language, right? So the trust will hold those things. Okay, those things will typically do all the work. Why? Doing work always comes with liability. Right? Now you try to mitigate that liability as best as possible, but doing things always has liability attached to it. So if the trust is doing things, the trust can be sued. You don't want the trust to be sued, especially if it's a generational wealth trust. You don't want 60 years of compounding wealth to be open to, overzealous lawyers. So The trust should not be doing anything. The trust should own companies that do everything, and those companies can be sued if if need arises. But those companies should typically live in a state of equity stripping, right? So there should never really be much of anything in the company, right? So that's how you want to proceed forward. Your risk tolerance is going to dictate how many companies there are under the trust, right? And how much diversity you have going on. So one of the companies that are going to be under the trust, it's always going to be a completely separate company that's not really doing a whole lot of much, is going to be your family office. Family office is going to be a completely separate company that doesn't really interact with any of the other companies. And what the family office does is it manages the investments of the family. So a family office is like your own private Wall Street, right? Every generational wealth family gets to a point where they run a family office. Now, what you'll see is, especially if you're like in a Western country, if you go looking up family offices and all of that stuff, you're going to see absurd numbers. Like, oh, you need $30 million to have a family office. Da, 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 da. The reason that you're going to see those things, and sometimes you'll even see, absurd numbers like that just for the trust. Excuse me. The reason why you see that is because the trust managers and the family office fund managers and all of that stuff, they make a percentage, right? They make a percentage of the fund and a percentage of the trust. That's how they get paid. So what they're doing as their business model is they're saying, okay, if we make 3% of every trust, then we need to be able to predict what we're going to be making per year, right? And so if the number that we want to make per year, right, and it's not even typically what we want to make it, they typically look at how many employees they think they need to deploy and all of that stuff. But if the number that we need per year is, let's just say, I don't know, let's say it's $1 million a year, $1 million a year as a company, that's the number that we need. Then they go backwards and they say, okay, we charge 3%, right? How many clients can we provide stellar service to without having so many clients that we start giving crappy service, right? Okay, we can handle 100 people based on our business model and how many employees we want and all that. We can handle 100 clients at a time. That's it. That's our max. All right, great. So of those 100 people all paying 3%, what does each person need to be worth in order for that 3% of those 100 people to equal $1 million, right? And that's where they get these, limitations of, oh, well, in order to work with our wealth management team, you need to have a minimum of $10 million in assets. And of that $10 million that's in assets, $500,000 needs to be in cash. They're doing that not because there's some formula that says that that's what you need to have in order to have a family office or a trust or whatever. They're doing that because it follows their business model formula of what they need to make per year. So in order for them to have their $1 million a year in billings, all of their clients need to be at a certain level. That's why they're doing that, right? So you can essentially have a family office at any level, right? It might not be a very big office. It might be one, right? One fund manager managing one fund, right? But you start somewhere, and you can definitely have that going. Now, government incentives are going to change as well. Like Singapore is an amazing country for family offices. They know that. They have incentives in place for that. So they do the same thing. In order to make it worth their while to give you tax exemptions and all of this, great stuff that they give, they got to be making X amount of dollars, right, in their economy. So they do the same thing where they're like, all right, if it's a family office and they've invested X amount, in Singapore, then they get all of these bonuses. Mind you, you can still have a family office in Singapore and not invest all X amount. You just don't get the bonuses, right? So that's where the kind of concept of, oh, okay, well, we need to have X amount of dollars in order to do this thing comes from. It's not real, right? It's just a matter of whoever is managing, what it is you want to do and how much money that they want to make. That's what's setting those standards, right? And there's a quality factor as well, of course, right? So once you get to a certain place, you want a certain kind of minimum return because you have a certain amount of money. You have access to essentially ultra high net worth accounts. There are different accounts, for different people that have different interest rates. So you actually get to a point where you're like, well, look, I can get 8% actually in a savings account now, right? Because I have enough money. Like if you have enough money, you can go to the bank and be like, look, this is the amount of interest I want, and you can negotiate that, right? So once you're ultra high net worth or even just high net worth, you start getting a little bit of negotiating power and all of that. So then in your family office, the same thing applies. Now you start looking at like, well, all right, if my office isn't going to get me at least 9% a year, then I don't want it. Like it doesn't make sense anymore, because I can just go to, JP Morgan wealth managers and get them to guarantee me 9%, and go from there, right? So that happens also as you start building. Your family office needs to get more sophisticated, which might mean that you need to go get a wealth manager who's already proven themselves out there and pay them like a salary, like it stops being a member of your family, right? And so in those situations now it's like, oh, okay, so I need to have a salary of $250,000 set aside above and beyond any ROI that I'm making, right? So these things change, the wealth aspect associated with the family office, which is why it typically comes right around the third generation where there's a whole lot of cushion in the compounding already, and now you want to take the compounding to the next level, right? Typically at that point you should have done, like your average ROI should be in the 10% area, right? By the time you get to third generation. And then when you start deploying your own fully fledged family office, you can jump that from 10% all the way up to like 40%, right? And then you start doing foundations and funds and endowments, and then that might put you in a position where you go from 40% to like 60%, right? And the family really, really takes off at that point. So that is the path forward as far as structuring is concerned. The trust fund is going to be at the top of that structure. There should be a buffer typically in between the trust fund and work that you're doing. Work should never be done out of the trust fund. Donations can be done from the trust fund, but work should never be done out of the trust fund. And then there should be that buffer there. And then the structures between the buffer and anything beneath them are going to be dependent on what it is you're doing. So the only company that won't have a buffer is going to be the family office. But a family office only works for that family. So there's no one who can sue the family office except the family, right? And that would be, and you wouldn't be suing the office, you'd be suing the manager. Like that would be if the manager did something wrong, or misappropriated something or whatever, then you'd sue the manager. So that is how that works. The family office is directly connected to the trust. There should be management and or holding companies that are directly connected to the trust, and then everything else should be either under one of those management companies or one of those holding companies. All right. We there with it. We still following along. Any questions on that? We got a yes on YouTube side. We're good on Facebook. All right. TikTok. Everybody got it? We're ready to keep it going, or are there any questions on that? All right. I'm going to take TikTok's silence as a yes. TikTok used to be like the loudest one. Now it's the quietest one, actually. All right. So we're good on that all the way up to the umbrella trust. Now, that trust is not going to be your last trust. Okay? So that generational wealth trust, it's going to be there for generational wealth purposes. The money in that trust is going to be dedicated to generational wealth for future generations and all descendants. It's going to be dedicated to making sure that when descendants have a business idea, that they have a place where they can take a loan or they can get VC funding, maybe even, or whatever from that internal mechanism. Um, Even sometimes set up where, the first house, there can be assistance getting that house. There are times when, like, we have a family that did all corporate housing, and so, their kids work for the corporation as soon as they're old enough. And so, and where they live, that's 14. So at 14, I think they can only work like 4 hours, a week or something like that at 14 or whatever. But they follow the law, and the kids get to intern for the maximum amount of hours at 14, 15, 16, whatever. Um, and that one ended up giving them an ancillary bonus. This is what happens when you have really strong structure. You'll get these ancillary bonuses that you did not think about in the first place. So this particular family, they set up their structure. The trust owned the company. The company owned housing, and the company used that housing as corporate housing, as well as there was some like Airbnb type things going on as well. And so the kid, the oldest kid anyway, was already older than 14 when the structure was put in place. I think he was 16. So he started interning for the company and being paid, right? W-2 pay, taxes, all of that. Of course, he's a kid, so the taxes got wiped out, but whatever, right? He's being paid. That also allowed money to go into like his retirement account, 401k, RRA, whatever, right? And so he's making minimum wage at 16, working the maximum amount of hours a 16-year-old can work, which I think was 16 hours for that state. Same thing at 17, same thing at 18. Now he's full time, right? Now he's working 40 hours a week. He lives in corporate housing. He drives a company car, right? So he doesn't own the house. He doesn't own the car, right? It's just the way that they had it set up. There was no deeper thought process behind it than that. Still making minimum wage because he doesn't need to pay for housing. He doesn't need to pay for his car. He really doesn't even need to pay for food, right? They had a what was it, DoorDash account or something like that. It wasn't actually DoorDash, but I can't think of what it was. So there was this account where food is just delivered to the house and whatever. Okay, fine. So remember, 16 years old, he's making minimum wage, federal minimum wage. 17 years old, federal minimum wage. 18 years old, federal minimum wage. 19 years old, federal minimum wage. Okay, we following so far? Great. 20 years old, federal minimum wage. 21 years old, federal minimum wage. 6 years, federal minimum wage. Hits 21, he can drink now. He's out at the bar. People see him in a nice company car, right? Take some girls home. They see the nice company house, right? He's living a real good lifestyle. 21, being a dumb kid, he's out there drinking shots, right? 6 years he's been making minimum wage. Okay. Girl marries him. Now he's 27. 7 years he's been making minimum wage. Baby comes, right? 8 years he's been making minimum wage. Girl says, I'm going to divorce you, take half the house. I want the car too to take care of the kids, and I want big time child support, right? 9 years making minimum wage. Judge takes a look at it, says, oh, he's been making minimum wage for 9 years. You can't have the house because a company owns the house and it's a corporate perk of his to be living in this house. It's not his house. You can't have the car. A company owns the car and it's a lease. Every 2 years there's a new car, which is why it looks like he has all these shiny new cars. He has a lease that's forever. This has been 9 years, right? 6 of those years before he ever met her. 2 of those years before he was even an adult. He's been making minimum wage. So the judge says you can't have the house, you can't have the car because neither one is his. And your child support is based on minimum wage. $50 a month for you. That's what you get. The family reported to us that she literally just handed him the kid, tried to sign off her rights, but the judge wouldn't allow that unless there's somebody else there waiting to get those rights. So handed him the kid, ran off, told the next guy that she had never had any kids, right? And did the same thing. Married the next guy, waited a year, had a kid, took him to court, tried to divorce him, take half the house or take all the house, take half the cars and all that. And with the next guy, it worked. Now they had not planned that as a protection. That was an ancillary benefit to their family structure. They had never thought about some random gold digger coming trying to take everything they left to their son. But because they had a solid structure, it didn't work out. Right now, that is part of their plan. Now it's recorded in their family constitution, in their archives, that this thing happened, and just by mistake, this was the way that they were protected from it. Right. So the thing with trusts are they're super powerful, but they're only powerful when they're not reactionary. You got to have these things in place before the BS hits for them to actually work. If you do a trust in reaction, even to an engagement, if you get engaged and in reaction to the engagement, you form a trust. And then let's say you don't get married for like 3 years. So that trust has been in existence for 3 years. Typically, your seasoning period is 2 years. So now you form a trust, the engagement lasts 3 years, and then you finally get married. You're like, oh, my trust is fully seasoned. It's past the 2-year point. No, you form the trust in reaction to the engagement so a judge can penetrate that trust, right? So the secret to these structures is making sure that the structure is created before anything has happened, right? The structure has to be in place before any problems arise. As long as the structure is in place before the problems arise, and the structure was designed well, you're bulletproof, especially offshore, right? Especially offshore. So you're good to go. If you do it in response to, there's a seasoning period for certain organizations, like Medicare and Medicaid and stuff like that. There's a look back period, right? Because you can make somebody eligible for a income-based service with the trust as well, right? So you can make an elderly parent who has a lot of assets, you can take all those assets and throw it into a trust, and now all of a sudden they're eligible for government assistance, in their old age, and they're not going to lose their house, and the kids aren't going to lose their inheritance from it, right? But there's a look back period of 5 years. So if you don't preemptively do all that stuff 5 years before it's necessary, and a lot of that stuff is necessary because somebody falls down the steps or somebody has a stroke, or it's not just, oh well, he's going to be 90 in 5 years, guess we should start now. No, a lot of that stuff comes out of nowhere, right? And now you need a nurse in the house 24/7. Then eventually you need them in assisted living facility, and and then you lose everything. Your entire inheritance is taken by the government to pay for those things, right? But if you have the trust established before any of that stuff happens, there's nothing for them to take. Okay, so it's all about planning. Planning matters. All right. Hey, Dia, how are you? Nice to see you again. All right, so the planning matters the most. If you have the planning in place, you're bulletproof. Bulletproof. I always remember the gold digger story to this day. It's such a great story, and the family feedback, we love that, because then we get to see what's happening with, the trust and how they're helping people and how they're affecting stuff. Because Diaspora Freedom Initiative is never the trustee. So we depend on those clients to come back and tell us what's going on for us to, really get a good, temperature gauge on how well the trusts are working. And that one was outstanding. Good morning. How are you? All right. Let's see. Okay. Any other questions on that? What's the difference between seasoning and a look back? Look back period is typically a law or some kind of rule in federal law, right? So look back period, like if you're doing like a Medicare trust, they typically have a 5-year look back period. So seasoning would typically be 2 years. So like 2 years in the trust is typically valid. But it depends on the jurisdiction, right? So there are definitely jurisdictions where the seasoning period is 10 years. We don't deal with any of those jurisdictions, but they exist. um, so the look back is normally like a law thing that allows penetration of trusts that have only been created in a certain amount of time. And the seasoning is almost like a universal measure of, has this trust existed long enough that we believe that it hasn't been created for the sole purpose of like evading creditors, right? Because most countries have a law on the books that'll say something to the effect of, well, like, listen, you're not actually doing family planning, and the only point of this trust is so that the or you don't have to pay back anymore, then the trust is null and void. It's a sham trust, right? So the purpose of the trust has to be something like our main trust or generational wealth trust, right? So the purpose of this is to create generational wealth for the next generation. It just so happened that it protected him from the gold digger, right? It just so happened that we've had bloodline clauses in some of the trusts, and the daughter was like, "Look, I'm pushing this baby out. I don't need no DNA test. Like, I know what it is." But they had to do it to be included in the trust, and it turns out that there was a problem with the emergency C-section that she had, and when they rushed the baby to the NICU, they switched it with another baby that was in the NICU. So when the blood test came back after the baby was stabilized with the emergency C-section, and they were able to do the blood test, both babies were still in the NICU. So that switch was able to be corrected. But had that not been part of the requirements of the trust, she would have took the wrong baby home, right? So it's not all about, petty situations. Some of it is about just foresight and making sure that your family legacy is intact, right? So there's all these kind of ancillary benefits that come out of, all of these requirements that sometimes people had never thought of, and it wasn't even the initial intent, of that policy. And then that's why it's great to have this feedback over the years, where clients from 12 years ago calling, "You'll never guess what just happened, and how the trust protected us, and the blah 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 blah." I'm good. Happy Monday. Happy Monday to you too, Dia. Yeah, yeah, definitely. Maybe. Sorry, guys. So the question was, so bloodline provision forces DNA test. Maybe it might. The bloodline provision, though, does say that whose bloodline is necessary for membership into the trust, right? But now you have to prove that. So typically, a DNA test is the proof of that, but there might be other requirements, right? Like you might have to publicly acknowledge the descendant. So even if the DNA test is positive, if they're not publicly acknowledged, then they're illegitimate, right? The technical term for that used to be bastard. Now bastard's like a curse word, so they don't like to use it. But if they're not acknowledged and they're illegitimate, that maybe might keep them out of the trust, depending on how you wrote the trust up, right? So that's why we were saying before, with your family constitution, figuring out what family is by definition is also important, because it may not just be blood. It might be blood plus acknowledgement. It might be blood plus acknowledgement plus rite of passage. There might be a different definition, a working definition that you guys are using for who is family, right? And that's so that indiscretions don't derail the trust, right? So if there's a child that's outside of the family education system, right, who then gains access to the trust and doesn't have the education, we've already explained what happens when you build a generational wealth family. and the descendants don't have any education, there's a 75% chance that that family falls apart, right? That all the wealth is gone in the very first generation. Even beyond that, there becomes a 50% chance that the wealth falls apart, right? So if there's a child of indiscretion that enters but hasn't gone through the education cycle, because maybe you don't know that they existed until they're already grown and now have access to the trust, their lack of education could cause them to completely just essentially bankrupt the trust, and now your entire family's legacy is destroyed because the way you designed your trust deed didn't allow you to manage who was actually a member of the family or a member of the trust at least, and who wasn't, right? And we've seen that happen a couple times as well, right? Luckily, we typically always have the bloodline clause, so it wasn't able to destroy anything, but we've definitely seen clients who are old GIs, and maybe they fought in the Korean War, or they fought in the World War II even. We've been doing this for 12 years, so we've seen all kinds of folks, Persian Gulf, whatever. And while they were over there, we even had some folks that were in Vietnam and all that stuff. And while they were over there, maybe a child of indiscretion was born, and they never knew about it, right? So they never even knew this child was there. So they didn't have the opportunity to include them in any kind of education or anything like that. And then in adulthood, the child shows up, but the child is not equipped to inherit a family, dynasty, right? And so that bloodline provision would have, full descriptions as to what a member of the bloodline actually is, not just their DNA results, and protect the greater, the greater family dynasty. Now, that doesn't mean that, that descendant doesn't get anything or is completely cut out or whatever, right? A lot of families will create endowments for people who are genetically related but are not qualified to be part of the family trust, right? So a situation like that, there may be an endowment that pays for their college, that helps them get their first house, helps them with the down payment for their first house and all of that stuff. So you can have an endowment set up that still helps people outside of the trust. And the endowment can be owned by the trust, right? Typically, you want to put a buffer in there so that no one gets confused, because people can try to claim, well, I'm confused, I think I should be part of the trust, and try to challenge the trust. But the endowment can be designed, and typically, what you would do is you'd have some sort of equivalency of, I know most of our viewers are US, so I'll use US terminology, but you'll have some kind of equivalency of a family operating, um, not trust, oh man, foundation, a family operating foundation, right? So look that up. There's a foundation, which is different. Foundations have to give 5% of their money away to 501c3 nonprofit organizations, but a family operating foundation, which is also 501c3, so it's also nonprofit, does not have to do that. So uh, private operating foundations, sometimes public benefit corporations can kind of handle that as well, and then they have the endowment attached and all of that. But normally there's some kind of structure that's set up that handles your kind of branch relative, endowment for people who are relatives, but they're not qualified to be in the trust. Right? You guys got that? Any questions about any of that? All right, solid, solid, solid. All right, so we have the basics The basics of building a dynastic family. Sometimes I hear people talk about a dynasty trust. Really, the names of the trusts are primarily marketing, um, or they're just used to describe what the goal of the trust is. Like our generational wealth trust is for building generational wealth, right? Dynasty trusts are for creating these dynasty families, so essentially they're for building generational wealth as well. But anyone can just call what they're doing with the trust or how they're writing the trust whatever they want. So don't assume that just because something is called a whatever trust that that's what it is. Really, what you have is you have either a testamentary trust, a revocable trust, or an irrevocable trust, and then trusts are the most fluid and most customizable of the legal documents worldwide. So you can design that trust to be whatever it is that you need it to be, and then so that people understand what it is that you're doing with the trust. Um, if you're a service provider and you're selling some kind of trust service, then that's where these names come from. So don't think that like one law firm's dynasty trust is the same thing as another law firm's. Right? They're just calling it that, or one person's generational wealth trust is the same as another one. They're just calling it that. So you definitely want to be able to understand what the elements are that you're looking for specifically so that you can look at anyone who's offering you a service and see if it matches up, right? Because they may be offering a legitimate service, but that legitimate service does not match your needs, right? So, and not everybody like us, we have a policy of like if what we do doesn't match what you want, we're just going to tell you like, hey, we're not the right service provider for you. You need to go find someone else. Or if we know who somewhere else is, hey, we recommend you go talk to these folks. Not everybody does that, right? Some folks just any paycheck they can get, they'll go for. So you definitely want to make sure that you understand what it is you need out of the situation and that you're able to judge the services that are being provided to see if they align with what you need. All right. Any other questions? We're at an hour and 42 minutes. So if there are no other questions, we gave you a full on generational wealth 101 here. A lot of information. So if you guys have absorbed all of that and you're good to go, then I will call it. Get ready to get my day started. Got a bunch of meetings today. A lot of you guys have booked, well, oh yeah, I guess, yeah. So a lot of you guys have booked consultations because of our holiday package. I might as well just get into that. So for you guys who are relocatees, you want to relocate, and when you relocate, you want to not have to work for the first few years that you are here. We have been able to drop a holiday special. We're pretty proud of it. It includes bond laddering. Okay, so the bond laddering is what's going to give you the passive income so that you don't have to work while you're here. It includes uh, your housing. If you want to, there's kind of like an upgrade package and a base package. So the base package includes your bond laddering, your immigration, a trust fund to manage all of that stuff for you. What else? Immigration. All your corporate compliance with our law firm, taking care of all of your like tax compliance and all of that stuff. And I believe that is it on the base level. So that is the base offering. Your all-inclusive offering is the upgrade right above that, which is what most people are super interested in. Because all of that, it's your immigration status, your bond laddering, so that you have passive income and don't have to work. It's your legal compliance, but then it's your land, right? You'll get a 50 by 100 plot of land, it's an eighth of an acre, here in Deani near the beach. And you'll also get a 1,600 square foot new construction. We'll build the house from the ground up, 1,600 square feet on that 50 by 100, which is within walking distance of the beach. So you get the land, you get the house construction built up, and all of that. So you literally have a full-on package. You'll be able to move here, You'd be able to have your own house. You'd have your own land. You'd have the trust fund that manages everything. You'd have the money working for you, giving you passive income for the next like 10 to 20 years, making sure that you don't have to work while you're here. So it covers all of those things. So that has been a huge holiday special. It will only last till about February, because then we can't guarantee the laddering for the rest of the year because essentially you waited too long, right? So the laddering is something that has to happen over the course of at least well, at least 6 months. Typically, sometimes like right now is a really good example of the two bonds that are available right now are both over 10 years and they're both over 10%. So in 1 month, you could actually buy both of them and get the bond laddering of 2 months because they have different payout dates. That doesn't always happen. So typically it takes 6 months. It takes us about 9 months to build the house. So typically by the time everything is done, it all happens together. And those payments start flowing into the account right about when you move in. So the timing on that means that it can't just be something that's always open. So we open it around the holidays. It closes around February. Around February, we waited too long. All right. So if that full package is something that you're interested in, that only costs $185,000 to get a brand new house. Brand new land, cultivated the way that you want it, all your immigration done, not have to work for the next 10 years, up to 20 years, but we like to manage expectations. So not have to work for 10 years and all that. Essentially, it's retirement in a box. So typically doesn't happen that way. It typically is closer to $250,000 to get that done. But because of our new relationships in China with our building materials and all of that, we are able to, and because of the interest rates of the laddering right now, we are able to offer that at a holiday discount for you guys. So that's what most of my meetings today are going to be about. I'm sure you guys are going to keep piling in on that because once it's gone, it might be gone forever. We cannot control bond rates. So once the government and the markets correct the bond rates and those interest rates dip down, that's it. They may never come back up. They may not come back up in your lifetime, right? For you generational wealth folks, bond laddering is about $75,000. You can actually create a generational wealth trust and bond ladder it so that you never have to touch it again, but it builds wealth quickly, right? So you guys can use the same technique. It's just not to retire you and move you over here. It would be to build your generational wealth trust extraordinarily quickly, right? Because you guys would be getting those payments pushed back into the trust, and then the trust would be out there reinvesting in accordance with your trust deed. So it's almost like you get a family office immediately, right? So super cool option for you guys as well. So you guys can always book a consultation with me for any of those things, and we'll move forward from there. And yeah, just make sure that you're ready because we cannot control bond rates, right? Once the bond rates return back to normal, that's it. Nothing we can do about it, and you're not going to have that opportunity again. All right. All right. So that has been it for me. It looks like there are no questions coming in on any of that. We've been here for 1 hour and 48 minutes, so I think I'm going to call it. You guys can throw a one in the chat if you have a quick question. I can definitely wait. Or you can hit enter if you're typing a question, and I'll wait for you to go ahead and finish it. Other than that, we will close up shop here. Looks like we're good. All right, guys. Thanks for hanging out. Always a pleasure to see you guys. Thanks for being here, Dia. Thanks for seeing you here, Eddie. Dan, thanks for coming through. And we will see you guys around the same time tomorrow. All right. Talk to you guys soon.